Welcome back to the channel. Today's lesson is titled Sling, Not Swing. So what is a sling? Well, it's a throwing action from a rotational movement. So we've talked about the basic underlying structure of our swinging motion as a underhanded high throwing action. So that's the throwing part. The slinging part is how higher level players, including the goats, feel when they release this racket into contact. That is the slinging feeling. So I think someone commented on the channel that you can't have acceleration and consistency. That's completely wrong. Actually, the faster you make this action, the more stable in flight this racket head will be in this edge thrown action. So we can, generate as much speed as our body will allow and the particular shot we're trying to hit will allow. We don't have to worry about that. So we get speed and consistency with this throwing out on the edge. And it's just a freewheeling, freeing motion that will really transform your game and maybe even your life. Before we talk about the modern technique of slinging, I want to go into a little bit of the background and history of slinging. So this is a sling. This is the thing that David used against Goliath in the Old Testament. Samuel, as the story goes, the Philistines and the Israelis were battling, and every day for 40 days, the champion of the Philistine army, Goliath, this giant warrior, came and challenged the Israelis to single combat. This is a tradition in the old days. You might have seen this in the movie Troy with Brad Pitt. And so for 40 days he issued this challenge for the Israeli champion to come forward, and it wasn't till a slender shepherd boy named David stepped up to the plate and said, okay, I'll take it on, that we see what happens next. So David, using 5 smooth stones and his shepherd's sling like this, was able to fell the giant Goliath with a stone to his head, knocked him down, and eventually killed him. The Israelis win, and the rest is biblical history. The next famous historical story about slinging takes place when Rome is battling Carthage in the Second Punic War, in the Battle of Metaurus. So the Romans had specialized battalions of slingers called funditores, which stands the Latin word for sling. And with the aid of these specialized battalions of slingers, the Romans were able to gain a key advantage in the Battle of Metaurus and win the war, which eventually led, of course, to the establishment of the Roman Empire. But the Roman funditores came from the islands of Balearic, which are islands off the coast of modern Spain and then ancient Rome. And there the slinging culture, I should say, was completely dominant, such that it was said that for Balearic children, the parents would put a loaf of bread on a post, and the children would have to knock off the bread off the post with a sling before they could eat. That's taking, deliberate practice and slinging to a whole nother level. So why were the Balearic Islands slingers so famous? Well, the sling gives, extra capacity to the human body So with this sling, simple as this, you can propel a rock or a pebble or whatever projectile it is 100 miles an hour using this rotational movement converted to a linear throw. And you can throw that pebble or rock or projectile 400 yards, so you can strike the enemy in a far distance. So, you know, this is what made the Balearic slinger so famous, and you can see the statue in the background here of one of their famous ancient slingers. But the tradition of slinging doesn't stop in ancient times. So the capital of the Balearic Islands is Mallorca, where the current day champion slinger is Rafael Nadal. And I'm sure there'll be a statue to him as well, maybe right side by side the ancient one. So we're still carrying on the tradition of slinging, even though we don't necessarily recognize it today, but we're going to take care of that in our lesson. So what's the difference between a swing and a sling? We've talked about this in several different ways, but it bears repeating because 99% of tennis players swing at a tennis ball with a poor technique. And that poor technique involves putting leverage and a pushing action into the handle of the racket and sending the head of the racket out too soon, too far, and then having to steer through contact. And in terms of the swing, it has the connotation of hitting the ball. And this is also too much of a dominant thought in most players' minds, is once they think about hitting the ball, they want to think about this swatting, levering action to hit it. And they're focused on that hit there. They're not focused on the overall form of the swing path. So slinging is fundamentally going to be different. It's going to be not using leverage, but using the pulling action of the body, followed by a lagging racket through contact, as we've been talking about in this beautiful spiraling inside-out motion. And so in terms of thinking, we're thinking as we gather all this energy and move it into contact that we're not steering and manipulating this racket. We're letting that action move out from the rotation of the core of our body in this spiraling motion that we're making with all the power of our big muscles. And we're letting that energy flow out into our hand and arm, and a natural release into contact. It's a sling. It's a free wheeling action, a free feeling action, totally different than consciously manipulating contact in a swing. And we've talked about the basic form of our topspin action as a spiraling action that we start with an out move, where the hands are close in the setup, and we go out, right? We take back, hands break, and now we're extending back, and then we're going to go in, dropping into the slot, and with the right sinking and body motion, the arm and the racket follow correctly the way they should and load correctly. We'll go into this more, but this is basically in, right? And then we have a out motion led by the body, driven by the body, racket lagging behind in line until we get to the turn of the swing, when the final pivot and stop of the upper body happens. And then we have the release of the racket in this area where 60% of our speed comes in. We're releasing it on edge and on an inside out path through the ball. And then of course we have once we go out, then we have the final in where we're relaxing into the follow through. We've also been talking throughout these lessons of transforming our swing from an arm-driven and arm-led action only, where the body remains stable or unused really, and recognizing, especially last week when we saw the pictures of Pete Sampras's sort of uncertain swing, and we see the the arc of the swing is all distorted. There's all kinds of manipulations through the path. It's almost impossible to make good contact that way at high speeds. Versus a Rafael Nadal slinging action where the arc of the swing is so stable, so smooth. Just by the visuals, you can see which is going to be the more consistent way to make contact. It's going to be this free swinging arcing motion that we want to go through, not a unsteady hand-driven motion. And that motion is driven by our body and anchored by the two swing centers in our lower pelvis and in our chest. So we're not moving that point of contact around, extending out or pulling back so that we have to make last minute manipulations. So we've talked about that issue, and we continue with that theme of a body-led and body-driven swing using a new training tool that I'm about to show you. So this is my new training tool, the tidal tank. And I just got it. I haven't had a lot of experience with it, but I like it already. So what do I like about it? Well, it's filled with air and water that you can see move around. That's like the energy that we're moving in our swing. So you have a visual and you have a sound, sloshing sound here as the water gets disturbed as you swing it or sling it. And it has two handles so that it's very similar to the wheel idea that we had in our swing, an earlier lesson. We're taking that wheel around and maneuvering it in a spiraling way. Well, this gives you the ability to do that pretty well. So not only are you moving this, but your hands and your forearms are rotating much like they would in an actual swing. The other thing this does is that beyond doing this with a hula hoop like we did it before, this provides you with the weight that you need so that your body drives this swing. So you can add as much water as you want. This is about a 2-pound ball now, which is heavy enough so that as you move this around, you really feel like it would be difficult to do just with your arms. So you really need to add your body, the loops and the bends that we've been talking about in order to correctly swing this. So as opposed to training aids, and I won't name them, but they're fine, I guess, for what they are, but they tend to encourage a arm-only kind of action. You could see players all the time just standing there, moving their arm like this, one after thousands of hits, just using their arm. You know, that's very problematic. So you want to think about training aids that are going to reinforce the deeper models that we are trying to build into the swings of our students. And so having something heavier, also the water provides an unstable sort of force around your body as you swing, so that your core of your body has to compensate for the unstable nature of this load as it goes around. So you have to brace your body and anticipate the pulling actions that this tidal ball makes on your body. And these are also good things that we want to start to feel when we have the light tennis racket in our hands. But again, the lightness of this racket encourages us to do the wrong thing, which is to move it just with our arm and hand. You know, the idea of taking the extra action and movement of our body to move this is just completely foreign to us. But that's what we need to do. So that's why this training aid, and I'll demonstrate how this might work for you, can be a good thing. So in our setup position, we have something like this in front of our chest, a little ways. Our right hand is down on the bottom of the racket and the top hand here's on the throat. And we talked about this out motion with an external rotation of our hitting shoulder up and out. And you can feel that when you do this, you know, you really have to move to do it with some grace and effort, smoothness. We have to do it with our body. And we do it with a pulling motion of our elbow and scap back here generally. So it goes up like that, feeling like there's air coming up underneath of our shoulder pits or elbow pits. And that's kind of exaggerated, but it's good to exaggerate at the beginning. So, you know, this is going to be the out move, with our body feeling our arms being relaxed and kind of heavy, if you will. They're not limp, you know, they're just relaxed and heavy, and they're following the course of our body movement. And you can see also, if you look closely, as I go back here, that my forearms and wrists are twisting backwards. So we're getting the same kind of action. If we're going to take the racket back, see how my forearms and hands also twist in this turn back. So it's reinforcing the proper movement of our hands and forearms as well. Now, of course, from the break position, we talk about now this drop into the slot. So how does that work with the tidal ball? So, and here's where the sloshing of the water can give us some good clues about our body movement. So when you are smooth with that action, dropping, you don't hear a lot of sloshing. The water just moves in this nice spiraling fashion, following the pull of your arms and hands. If you sort of jerk it back, you can hear the slosh. We use leverage. You know, there's a lot of sloshing going on, a lot of inefficiency in our movement. It may not be exact parallel to the body's energy and movement as we swing, but I think it's pretty analogous and generally accurate, and a good reinforcing cue. So we have this, remember, we're doing this all, of course, in our athletic posture, because we're gonna need to be able to rotate out on this axis, this tilted axis. So we can't be standing up straight and doing this and moving like this. We have to be down in athletic posture, and we need our whole body to do it, sort of rising in our knees or hips or torso with a nice stretch and extension. Now, because we have both hands on this ball, we can't exactly do the handbrake as we might want, but there's even a way of doing that, but we'll leave that aside for now. We're just thinking about the movement of the body dropping into the slot. So if I'm in my tilted axis, and it's going to be a whole body action, and I'm going to go up, reach back, and then sink with a side bend of my body that we talked about last time. That's going to connect my hitting arm to my rotating body. But first, you know, we have to get this racket back here slotted. And so the tidal ball can help us do something that most players don't do, which is as they take it back and they drop into this slotted area, they tend to short circuit the loading. If we have time, we don't always have time to do this, but if we have time, this racket should be wound, and the arm and wrist and forearm should be wound back so that the racket points to the back side fence. So most players, you know, because they've been brainwashed with a unit turn mentality, just think that this is the take back. They just turn their body as one unit, and then they just drop the racket to the side. There's a real no loading in the hitting arm and back area. So if we use the momentum of this turn back with our body, the momentum of this turn as the racket follows our hands and we get to the pivot point back here, the centrifugal force going out as we bring this down sends the head of the racket back that way that we want and loads the wrist and forearm the way we want. So it looks something like this. So we move up, and then as we come down and side bend, we feel the pull of the water back here, and we let that pull happen. And that, see, my arm is nice and coiled here in the slot just by letting the momentum of our swing place us in there. So again, as we're using the forces of nature, the centrifugal force of this ball now, but we can feel that because it's heavier, but we want to do the same thing with the racket. And so we want to feel, as we make the handbrake and coil back here, that we feel the momentum of this racket is swinging back. And it's pulling on our hand if we let it. And we feel it. And we just let it go. And now this arm is all wound back the way we wanted it in the slot, fully loaded. So that's another motion that we'll get into our practice session and focus on. But now we're coming to the movement forward from the slot. And because we've done this side bend, now you can see how as I side bend, even now in slow motion, sort of, I've made this little transition move, this little bump forward with my hip, and the weight has started to shift to my inside of my lead foot. This is going to be the braking mechanism for the hips as they unwind, is we have to get the weight early into our lead side for this throwing action. And so that's another small circle learning feature that we'll focus on in practice, but I'm giving you the movement map now, is that in addition to dropping, side bending, and down into the slot and winding the racket back, we have this lateral bump. Now we're going to be on a rotational path, not a linear path, so that bump is sort of going in that path of our hips are going to turn. Remember, we had the drill last week about the hips staying back and pivoting around the chair. So our extension or the hip bump is not to the, if I were doing a linear stroke like this out here, but we're still on the rotating path. So the hip bump is to the left. Now, do we always see it and do we always feel it? No, because we don't necessarily have time to do this complete swing all the time. It varies, almost every swing. But we're always building the ideal, most powerful, efficient swing that we can for any given moment. So we have to build the model for the completely powered swing into our mentality and into our muscle memory. So getting this bump, lateral bump, we're only shifting around the circle path an inch or two forward like this, but this is putting pressure into the ground and getting our weighting starting to shift. And it also recenters us as we drop. We're coming from a position where maybe 70% of our weight is on our trail leg. And we don't want to be having to generate our swing with all the weight on our back. We want this weight then to be recentered as we sink into this position. And so this lateral shift gives us this recentering, sinking move. And now from this recentered position, now we have gathered all of our energy for the most powerful swing or sling that we can do. So we'll practice the lateral bump in the deliberate practice session. So then we talked about how the first move out of the slot is the master move, where we're not trying to lead or push the handle towards the target right away, which so many people recommend. As you can see, as I do this right away, the racket head is traveling out on the swing circle, and pretty soon it's lined up with our hands, all the issues that entails. So with a pulling action and the center mass of the racket following the pulling action, you remember that lesson. So as we pull out of the slot out to the right, so that's second base. If we were a batter, then we're pulling out towards more the second baseman between first and second base. Not exactly 90 degrees, no, but more or less a 45 kind of ish angle. Out to the right for the first fractions of a second as the racket head lines up behind our hand. And then as we move out to the turn of the swing, that's when the hips have started to decelerate and almost stopped. And now the torso is starting to accelerate up and through, and we'll eventually get to where the non-hitting side is freezing or blocking that movement so that our hitting side then can accelerate through. That's sort of the mechanics of it. So with the tidal ball, we will practice this motion from a body-led, body-driven perspective instead of an arm-driven perspective. So we're back in the slot here. We made our bump and our transition move, so now we're more recentered. And so now the first movement is going to be out to the right as we start off. This is much like we throw a frisbee out to the right. And then as our body turns, the arm swings around to throw it to contact. Same in proper tennis, is we're starting out with this swinging, and you can see that even the master move, the pronation, the supination of my right hitting arm happens as I tuck back here. We don't really have the lowering of the racket head because we're sort of attached to this ball here, but we know that that happens in most swings. So it's in a semi-open stance from the slot, recentered, and then coming out to the right, and then our whole body is driving up in the spiraling rotational movement, and our arms are just following. So this is where we get much more of a feeling of a sling, where our arms are fairly passive and they're just following the body motion that we've created. And as we come up and turn into the swing, and our hands, you can see my forearm and hands starting to pronate through contact, just as we reach contact, bringing up the head and releasing the hands, and they end up with the racket going then finally past the hands in something like that motion. So we will, in practice, we'll practice flinging this heavier object than the racket to see if our body can drive the right motions. So if that flag over there is the target, and I'm in my open stance slot and I'm coming up, I'm going to see if I can just use my body, let my arms relax, and see if I can have the ball get tossed generally in the direction of the target. So something like this. Another important feeling in the release of the racket in this slinging motion is a kind of a slingshot, another version of it, action, where as we reach the end and the non-hitting side is blocking our rotation on our non-hitting side to allow our hitting side to rotate through, you see this picture so often in the newspaper now, where there's a stretch across the chest out into the hitting arm as the person is blocking here. And this is, along with being powered by the body, there's a release of this stretch. And so in the release of the racket is at least two phases that I want you to identify and focus on. Is phase one is this first initial movement out of the slot, out to the right. And I call this phase of the swing the runway, because just like an airplane accelerating straight down the runway, this is what we feel like at this moment, is just the racket head trailing behind in a straight line out to the right. And when we get to the turn of the swing, which is when the racket starts to, on its own, the head starts to pivot around to the outside, centrifugal force pulling the arms and the racket head out on the swing circle. When we get to that point, I call that the takeoff. So in the runway, contrary to our common sense views about things, in this initial turn is when we achieve the maximum hand speed, like somewhere around 20 miles an hour for all swinging sports, golf, baseball, and tennis. So because the arms are pulled in to the core of this initial rotating body, this action out of the slot is the fastest hand action we have at that point in the swing. Now, as we get to the turn of the swing, the momentum and energy is passing out through our hand into the racket handle. The hand actually slows down in all three sports. So we go fast and then we start to slow down, not consciously, but just by the nature of the swing, as the kinetic chain passes the energy out to the distal areas. Our hand slows down and then becomes this fulcrum, this anchoring point that generates the angular momentum where we get all the racket head speed. But our hand is actually traveling slower through the last third of this swinging action. So again, so much technique is contrary to common sense and common beliefs. And contrary to all the advice that says to really get a fast swing, we need to throw our hand and throw the racket towards the target as fast as we can. That just totally destroys the swing and destroys swing speed. We need to have it sequenced. Phase one of the sequence, where the hands are close into the body and tightly coordinated with this initial turn out, and then coordinated with the turn of the swing, and then the free extension of this energy out into our arms. The torque of our body and the turn of our body, the pivot of our body, is being transmitted into the handle of the racket in this twisting angular motion that goes all the way through contact. We reach the contact area with our hand ahead, the racket down and behind. And then as our body is completing this twisting, turning, the hand and the forearm are pronating on their own through transmission of the torquing energy and momentum of our body out into our arm, out into our forearm, out into our wrist, and then snapping the racket around and through contact. All done relatively automatically and passively. We don't have to manipulate it. If our body action and form is correct, it's all going to happen on its own. And the timing of it will be just about perfect for closing the racket the way we want to and direct. And as I said in a much earlier demonstration lesson, that when we're throwing this racket head out on edge in this windshield wiper action from the slot, not in this horizontal swinging gate action, when we throw it out on edge, the faster we generate action on this, the more stable in flight this racket head edge is, just as you saw in the pictures of Nadal and his beautiful swinging arc. Again, just like an airplane, the dynamics of the airflow over and under the wing of an airplane creates lift on the airplane's wing and stabilizes the wings in flight. So I think someone commented on the channel that you can't have acceleration and consistency. That's completely wrong. Actually, the faster you make this action, the more stable in flight this racket head will be in this edge thrown action. So we can, generate as much speed as our body will allow and the particular shot we're trying to hit will allow. We don't have to worry about that. So we get speed and consistency with this throwing out on the edge. And it's just a freewheeling, freeing motion that will really transform your game and maybe even your life. Now let me demonstrate the slinging action using another new training aid. This is the rope bat. And you can see that the rope bat, like the whip towel that we created in an earlier lesson, we'll go back to that later, is that it has a semi-flexible handle. The rope, of course, the towel we had is totally flexible, but then it has a length of rope of some kind of cord that's totally flexible, and then it has a weighted end, which corresponds to the barrel of the bat. This is where we want to make contact with the ball. So the same idea in using this training aid as we did with our towel whip is that we want to get away from our everyday use of our body and arms. When we pick up a light, stiff, rigid object, is to want to try to use leverage on the handle and move it in this manner. This is pushing levering action. With the rope bat, of course, that option is taken away. So when I lever into the handle like I would do normally with a racket, you see the rope structure breaks down. There's really no way to swing effectively with this levering action. So what's the only way to move the rope bat, as again turning the racket into a whip flexible thing, is in a pulling action, continuous pulling action. And just like the tennis racket, remember the center mass concept is that the center of mass is the average weighted mass of an object, and so it's the balance point on a racket up here near the head of the racket where most of the weight is. Well, the center of mass, most of the weight in this rope bat is up here, of course, in this heavy rubber part. And so, again, the center of mass would be somewhere in here. Why this is important concept to understand, again, is in the pulling motion, just like we saw the car pulling the trailer, wherever the car pulled the trailer just center of mass just followed smoothly behind. So as we are pulling this racket out of the slot, the racket head is going to line up behind our pulling hand, straight in line. Or if we pull it back, pulling action, the racket head is following the flow of my pull very beautifully, very smoothly, as opposed to any levering action, taking it back, the head flies out on the path, totally losing connection with the body. This is connecting everything into this spiraling flow that we want, and the energy that we saw in the tidal tank moving around smoothly. The other reason that this rope bat is going to be an effective training tool, I just got it, so I'm not that familiar with it, but I've seen demonstrations of other teachers that use this in this way, is that it tends to reinforce the idea of a body-led, body-driven movement instead of a arm-led, arm-driven movement. So you can demonstrate this by just resting the rope bat's head against your back like this, as if we were in some sort of, take back position, but it's just resting there comfortably in a relaxed arm. Now I'm going to try to initiate the dip and swing of the racket just with my body, just letting my arms be passive, and see how it looks. So if I'm down here and then I rotate my body, and let my arms follow that and fling out on the circle, we get an approximation of the body's turn in action. We add the dip, and you can hear the whoosh even of the racket whipping around the swing circle, all driven and led by the body movement, not by an arm movement. The opposite of that would be, the only way to swing this around in any way, the old way, a levering pushing action, is to line up the head with the racket handle, rope handle, and swing it around. And you can see right away that's going to go to outside in swing path. We want a inside out swing path, much like that is demonstrating. The rope bat also helps us feel the loading of the arm into the drop into the slot, like we demonstrated with the tidal ball. So if I'm taking this up and handbrake and then dropping into the slot and letting the momentum of the head follow, you can see that the head starts to pull back my arm and coil my wrist and forearm the way it should, just by the momentum of the heaviness of this head. With the tennis racket, it's very hard to feel. That's why a training aid that's heavier at the end helps us do that. And then, of course, once we get it slotted back here, and our forearm and our wrist wound back like they should, and we start to come out of the slot initially, then we can look at the path of the head trailing the hand at the initial part of the forward swing again. So is this head swinging around and out too soon? We can start to detect that more with this rope training aid. So from the slot, we're gonna drive out to the right with the handle, and you can see that the head basically stays behind my hand for this short time until I hit the turn of the swing, the pivoting of the upper torso, the stopping of the non-hitting arm, and the final release. And we get the same pulls, the same transformation of torquing energy in our body out into the torquing of the handle and eventually the racket through contact that we want. So again, this enables us to feel this motion a little bit better in our wrist and forearm. We really feel that the tug and the twisting actions of our body being transmitted to the racket much more easily with the rope bat. Now, just for the heck of it, I'm gonna have a never practice this, see if I can hit a ball on a tee towards the target using the rope bat and see what happens. We'll see if this swinging motion produces the target direction and other things that we might want, although we can't. So it might look like this. And you can see that it flew to the right of the target. So in practice, I would know that I'm not really haven't completed the rotation of this upper part of my swing, and my swing is coming in too late. So now we would tee up another one and see if we can fix that. See if I can get my rotation working and the pulling of my non-hitting side through a little bit better so that the racket head is coming through better squaring to target than it did that last time. So semi-open stance, athletic posture. I'm going to go and drop it to the slot, spiraling motion. And you can see it went just left of the target, went kind of low, which again shows me that my path through contact there wasn't enough vertical path through it. So the next time I'm gonna work on lifting it, not lifting it consciously, but maneuvering my body so that there's more vertical path through contact. And now we're like David, except we're gonna use a tennis ball instead of a stone. We're gonna see if we can execute a shepherd swing. So the way this sling works is that there's one cord that has a little finger loop that goes around your index finger, and another sort of knotted cord at the end that you hold in the tips of your fingers. And this is what we're going to release at the right moment so that this flap opens and the ball goes towards the target. That's the idea. Again, I haven't practiced this very much. Let's see if it comes anywhere towards any target. It's something like that action. So those are the principles and feels of the slinging process. We're moving from an arm-centric, arm-driven swing, linear swing, to the spiraling motion in which the body is doing the driving and the energy is flowing out to the extending arms, and the free release of the racket head through contact. That's a sling, and that's what we want. Now in the deliberate practice how-to section of the lesson, and we're going to be working on the same sorts of exercises that I had demonstrated during the movement map. But these training aids I just received and started to use, I think they're good, but I can't recommend that anyone go out and buy them. For one thing, this tidal tank ball is $80 and this rope bat is $50. So I have an alternative for you. Substitute tidal ball tank, the medicine ball with an unstable force of water in the tank. You can basically use an old pillow that you might have with a zipper and buy yourself 3 1-pound bags of pinto beans. They're $2 each, and put them in a baggie, a secure Ziploc baggie like that. And you just put them around different parts of the pillow. You don't worry about it too much. They're going to sort of move around and give you that 3-pound weight, which is about the weight of that tidal tank ball that I had, and we can have the same form and some of the same feelings. Is it as good? Not really, but it's pretty close, and it'll do for this exercise. And for our rope bat, we can use the old whip towel that we built from one of our very first lessons. I'm sure you thought we would never get back to this, but sure enough, we have. For those who want to go back and look at that lesson, how I built it, but basically it was just attaching a pound of pinto bags and taping it up to one end of the towel. And so grabbing it at about 27 inches, we have our rope bat or rope racket. And as always, when we start this how-to section of exercises, don't try to do it if you're injured or stiff in any way with any part of your body, especially your back. And be sure that you do all these exercises properly, with a nice athletic posture, 30% about tilt forward, straight back, a little slightly hump maybe, that's fine, but we don't want to be arched and we don't want our pelvis sticking out, because we want to be able to do these rotational movements without straining the lower lumbar spine, which can only rotate 5 degrees each way. Chest area, 45 degrees each way. So the first exercise I'll have you do is 10 slow motion, and I'll just call this our mid ball, with the new mid ball here. And we'll do the out in form as I demonstrated in the movement map. So we'll be in our athletic posture in the ready position, and I want you to focus on all the feels and principles that we've been talking about, which is that we want this whole movement to be a whole body movement, using your whole body to move these things, and let this be a body driven and body led action, not a standing here and moving your arms about action. That's what we're trying to get away from. So when you make this first initial out move, I want you to feel like your whole body is doing it, and that there's sort of air rising up underneath your shoulders here and arms as you lift this up. It's nice and smooth, and feel the billowing air lifting it up as effortlessly as you can with the whole body. And then in the sink and coil into the slot in slow motion, I want you to feel this dip, the side bending, the turning back, letting this momentum of the med ball take your arms back and coil this way, so your arm and wrists are coiled approximately in that position that you would have with the racket in the slot. And I want you to add the hip bump that we talked about, this recentering move as you move down, hip bump and recentering, so that we have all of our power gathered in a centered way before we start our slinging process. So that's the in move, And now we're into the out move. And again, I want the rotation of the body to be leading and driving this force. So I want you to concentrate on that spinal column that we have running down at 30 degrees on our tilt, and the two swing centers in our pelvis and our chest as the center points of this rotation. So you really have to focus and start thinking about movement from the inside out. So you're really going to be getting that feeling that everything is coming from an inner rotation that's then moving out to the periphery and eventually out to the arms. It's a lot of words and there's a lot of feels in there. So you'll have to, be practicing this and pausing after each repetition, see if you can improve it. And then of course, just coming out the runway, we're going out to the right in an inside out path, and we can make this a little bit more forceful. That's when our hands are the fastest. But then as we get to the turn of the swing and that our hips have stopped rotating or starting to stop, our shoulders starting to stop, and then our hands are extending out and up in this flinging action of the takeoff, and then just bring it back in. So 10 slow motion, out in form. I'll pause the video. And just like we did in our sequence, now we're gonna have you throw your med ball at a target that you picked out or created. And we're gonna do this at medium fast speed because we just need, to develop some real momentum to actually throw it. But I want you to have the feeling, we talked about the basic form of the topspin forehand as a high underhand throw. So that's what we're looking for here. Except we're doing it with our form of out in, and we're letting our hands release this way so that our forearm is pronating through contact as we release. And we'll have a high release because we're going to toss this in high. You don't have to toss it that far, but I'm only 6 or 7, 8 feet away from this target. And we're going to pause between each rep to see if we can refine our form, our movement, make sure that we're following all the principles that we just went over in the throwing action. And each time you have to sort of think, well, was I in my posture, or did I come out of my posture all the way? Was it really body led and body driven, or did I just really use my arms at the end? Did I get the inside out path and the high finish that we want with the arms pronating, the hitting arm especially pronating as we release? So I'm not going to demonstrate this now, I'll just have you do it. So I'm going to pause the video for 10 medium, not super fast, medium's fast, because I still want you to have some awareness and recognition of the movements as you go through them. Medium fast, throws at a target, pausing each time. I'll pause the video. Now I want you to do the out in form with your racket, picking up your racket, in the right grip in the fingers, bottom 3 fingers controlling, hopefully in a Western or semi-Western grip. And you'll notice right away after you pick up this racket, you'll say, oh my gosh, this is so light now after that 3-pound med ball. And that's really the feeling that you want to recognize the difference of how this weighted racket feels now, or how the racket without the weight feels. But just because it's light, we don't want to go back to our old patterns of arm-led and arm-driven movement. It's quite easy to do, and you'll probably fall into this a little bit. This is one of the things you need to be aware of as we go through this in slow motion. But now, because we have the racket, we can refine and make these actions a little bit more precise. So as we wind back in the in way and we wind the racket and drop into the slot, we really want to make sure that this racket momentum, the head of it's carrying you back into a more coiled arm position and wrist position. Let's not short circuit it by just going here and then moving out. Let's get the full form, the full loading going, right? And make sure that we're also doing the sink and the side bend so that we're gonna bring the arm, connecting it to the rotating body before we start that rotation. And then we have the hip bump and the recentering move so that all of our weight is centered now and all of our power is centered as we're going to engage in that slinging action. Make sure that we're driving out on the runway to the right initially. And this can be forceful, even in slow motion. You can feel the torque and the quick turning of the body driving this out on the runway. And then as we get to the turn of the swing, feel the left hip, lead hip stop rotating. This is starting to decelerate the torso as this comes up and through. We're gonna tuck the non-hitting arm in with an internal shoulder rotation down here somewhere so that we really can arrest that and block that movement so that we can really feel like this is gonna shoot through. Of course, we're doing this first one in slow motion, but we're trying to get all these positions and feels as we do it. So I'll pause the video for 10 slow motion out in reps, pausing each time for you to reflect on how you can do it better. I'll pause the video. And as we usually do in this sequence, the last of these sequence is a fast swing, not maybe the maximum speed, but a fast swing, because we're going to have to get this form going and down into something like a second in order to actually play tennis. So we have to then try to get all these feels integrated and smoothed out and speeded up as we do it. So 10 fast swings of the out in form, trying to keep all the principles that we've been talking about, body-led, body-driven, trying to hit your spots so that the body and the racket and hand are loading at each phase and unloading when they should. We're throwing out on edge. So I'll pause the video for you to do 10 fast shadow swings of that. Now for the whip towel or rope bat exercise. Again, you've made your whip towel, got a pound here at the end of the towel, and just like I demonstrated in the movement map, I want you to be in your athletic posture with just the end of the whip bat or rope whip towel resting, the head of it resting on your back like this. And we're just going to try to initiate and build our swing from the rotation of our body, sort of using a minimal amount of arm action as we can. There's probably going to be a little, because this towel's so light and it might not do everything that we want. So we can cooperate maybe a little with our hands, but we really want the feeling that the rotation's coming from the center of the body, or swing centers, very deep in our body. And that's really that core turn is then moving out to the periphery of our body that's turning, then out to our arms and into our hands. So we're in athletic posture. To get this started, I think having a little dip into the right hip, like we're placing our pressure in that for a good topspin forehand, kind of helps us get this going. So it's sort of like and I want you to feel that the hips turning are leading the motion. And that's how it should be in a topspin. Our hips lead the way, followed by our torso, followed by our shoulders and arms. So really at the beginning of this, with the sinking and turning, you're really focusing on that initial hip turn and drive, and then followed by the pulling action of the non-hitting side. And it's kind of tight in when you have it both hands on the towel, but that's okay. But you don't want your hands to be doing it, or your arms. you want your body to do it, and you want this to be extending out and pulling on your arms a little as you extend. Not as heavy as the med ball, but you can still feel some centrifugal outward pulling force as you fling this up and around in the spiral path that we're talking about. So I want you to do 10 slow motion out in form, starting from this position, starting from the lower body, rotation, sinking and rotation, then into the upper body as you fling up and out. And I'll pause the video for you to do 10 of those. Now I want you to pick up your racket now. This is your new whip towel, if we will. We're still going to do 10 medium fast swings starting from this same position. Just going to let you sort of rest that up here as you've externally rotated your shoulder, and we're just resting it here comfortably, relaxed arm. And it's from here you can start this dip and drop a little bit better. Again, we're gonna start with a dip and drop and turn of our lower body transferred into the turn of our upper body, you know, up into our shoulders and arms. So, you know, we're gonna and I can feel this really extending and slinging action as I move it with my body. That's what we want. So again, all the feelings of that slinging action that we've been talking about, I want you to do them 10 fast swings, pausing each time to see if you can refine it, keep it body driven, keep it being driven from the inside out in an extending path in that spiral form that we've been talking about. I'll pause the video. And finally, the exercise is out on the court, even though we're not on the court now, with your training partner who's giving you a nice rhythmic toss, nice high toss, so you have time to adjust. And I want you to hit 10 medium balls cross court, training partners out of the way of the firing line, working on this out in, out form, and working in all the feels and principles while you're hitting these 10 balls. If you feel comfortable after you've done those 10, and don't move on if you haven't, you just keep practicing that. If you feel pretty comfortable, then let's add the two sort of basic movements that we will always have in the topspin forehand, which is, you know, an inside out and an inside in move. So if I'm standing sort of in the middle of the court and my partner is tossing usually out to my forehand for a cross court, for the inside out and inside in, he's going to toss to the other side, so that I just have to take a couple steps, shuffle steps, and then orient my body for an inside out path for that hit, and 10 of those. And then the same thing for the inside in, a couple shuffle steps, but now I'm oriented for an inside in down the line topspin forehand. Medium speed, working on our form. We don't care too much about where exactly it goes or how it goes. So we're just working on the form and with a little bit more movement. So I'll pause the video for you to do that on a court. Now, if you've made it through this entire lesson and done all the exercises of slinging, I can welcome you to the elite cohort of slingers down through history and down through sport. Now, maybe no one will erect a statue to you like this slinger in the background up here, but people will notice that your game is at a different level, and they'll come up to you and ask you, hey, how do you hit the ball like that? And your answer will be in 4 words: I sling, not swing.